The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 17. Religion as the Law of Life. Here then lies one secret of the divergence between the ancient and the modern, the Eastern and Western ideal, and here also one clue to their reconciliation. Both rest upon a certain strong justification, and their quarrel is due to a misunderstanding. It is true, in a sense, that religion should be the dominant thing in life, its light and law, but religion as it should be and is in its inner nature, its fundamental law of being, a seeking after God, the cult of spirituality, the opening of the deepest life of the soul to the indwelling Godhead, the eternal omnipresence. On the other hand, it is true that religion, when it identifies itself only with a creed, a cult, a church, a system of ceremonial forms, may well become a retarding force, and there may therefore arise a necessity for the human spirit to reject its control over the varied activities of life. There are two aspects of religion: true religion and religionism. True religion is spiritual religion, that which seeks to live in the Spirit, in what is beyond the intellect, beyond the aesthetic and ethical and practical being of man, and to inform and govern these members of our being by the higher light and law of the Spirit. Religionism, on the contrary, entrenches itself in some narrow pietistic exaltation of the lower members, or lays exclusive stress on intellectual dogmas, forms, and ceremonies, on some fixed and rigid moral code, on some religio-political or religio-social system. Not that these things are altogether negligible, or that they must be unworthy or unnecessary, or that a spiritual religion need disdain the aid of forms, ceremonies, creeds, or systems. On the contrary, they are needed by man because the lower members have to be exalted and raised before they can be fully spiritualized, before they can directly feel the Spirit and obey its law. An intellectual formula is often needed by the thinking and reasoning mind, a form or ceremony by the aesthetic temperament or other parts of the infrarational being, a set moral code by man's vital nature in their turn towards the inner life. But these things are aids and supports, not the essence. Precisely because they belong to the rational and infrarational parts, they can be nothing more, and, if too blindly insisted on, may even hamper the suprarational light. Such as they are, they have to be offered to man and used by him, but not to be imposed on him as his sole law by a forced and inflexible domination. In the use of them, toleration and free permission of variation is the first rule which should be observed. The spiritual essence of religion is alone the one thing supremely needful, the thing to which we have always to hold and subordinate to it every other element or motive. But here comes in an ambiguity which brings in a deeper source of divergence. For by spirituality, religion seems often to mean something remote from earthly life, different from it, hostile to it. It seems to condemn the pursuit of earthly aims as a trend opposed to the turn to a spiritual life, and the hopes of man on earth as an illusion or a vanity incompatible with the hope of man in heaven. The spirit then becomes something aloof, which man can only reach by throwing away the life of his lower members. Either he must abandon this nether life after a certain point, when it has served its purpose, or must persistently discourage, mortify, and kill it. If that be the true sense of religion, then obviously religion has no positive message for human society in the proper field of social effort, hope, and aspiration, or for the individual in any of the lower members of his being. For each principle of our nature seeks naturally for perfection in its own sphere, and if it is to obey a higher power, it must be because that power gives it a greater perfection and a fuller satisfaction even in its own field. But if perfectibility is denied to it, and therefore the aspiration to perfection taken away by the spiritual urge, then it must either lose faith in itself and the power to pursue the natural expansion of its energies and activities, or it must reject the call of the Spirit in order to follow its own bend and law, dharma. This quarrel between earth and heaven, between the Spirit and its members, becomes still more sterilizing if spirituality takes the form of a religion of sorrow and suffering and austere mortification, and the gospel of the vanity of things. In its exaggeration, it leads to such nightmares of the soul as that terrible gloom and hopelessness of the Middle Ages, in their worst moment, when the one hope of mankind seemed to be in the approaching and expected end of the world, an inevitable and desirable pralaya. But even in less pronounced and intolerant forms of this pessimistic attitude with regard to the world, it becomes a force for the discouragement of life, and cannot, therefore, be a true law and guide for life. All pessimism is to that extent a denial of the Spirit, of its fullness and power, an impatience with the ways of God in the world, an insufficient faith in the divine wisdom and will that created the world and forever guide it. It admits a wrong notion about that supreme wisdom and power, and therefore cannot itself be the supreme wisdom and power of the Spirit, to which the world can look for guidance and for the uplifting of its whole life towards the divine. The Western recoil from religion, that minimizing of its claim and insistence by which Europe progressed from the medieval religious attitude through the Renaissance and the Reformation to the modern rationalistic attitude, that making of the ordinary earthly life our one preoccupation, that labor to fulfill ourselves by the law of the lower members, divorced from all spiritual seeking, was an opposite error. The contrary, ignorant extreme, the blind swing of the pendulum from a wrong affirmation to a wrong negation. It is an error because perfection cannot be found in such a limitation and restriction, for it denies the complete law of human existence, its deepest urge, its most secret impulse. Only by the light and power of the highest can the lower be perfectly guided, uplifted, and accomplished. The lower life of man is in form undivine, though in it there is the secret of the divine, and it can only be divinized by finding the higher law and the spiritual illumination. On the other hand, the impatience which condemns or despairs of life or discourages its growth because it is at present undivine and is not in harmony with the spiritual life, is an equal ignorance. Andam tam. The world-shunning monk, the mere ascetic, may indeed well find by this turn his own individual and peculiar salvation, the spiritual recompense of his renunciation and tapasya, as the materialist may find by his own exclusive method the appropriate rewards of his energy and concentrated seeking. But neither can be the true guide of mankind and its lawgiver. The monastic attitude implies a fear, an aversion, a distrust of life and its aspirations, and one cannot wisely guide that with which one is entirely out of sympathy, that which one wishes to minimize and discourage. The sheer ascetic spirit, if it directed life and human society, could only prepare it to be a means for denying itself and getting away from its own motives. An ascetic guidance might tolerate the lower activities, but only with a view to persuade them in the end to minimize and finally cease from their own action. But a spirituality which draws back from life to envelop it without being dominated by it does not labor under this disability. The spiritual man who can guide human life towards its perfection is typified in the ancient Indian idea of the Rishi. One who has lived fully the life of man and found the word of the supra-intellectual, supramental, spiritual truth. He has risen above these lower limitations and can view all things from above. But also he is in sympathy with their effort and can view them from within. He has the complete inner knowledge and the higher surpassing knowledge. Therefore, he can guide the world humanly as God guides it divinely, because, like the divine, he is in the life of the world and yet above it. In spirituality, then, understood in this sense, we must seek for the directing light and the harmonizing law, and in religion only in proportion as it identifies itself with this spirituality. So long as it falls short of this, it is one human activity and power among others, and even if it be considered the most important and the most powerful, it cannot wholly guide the others. If it seeks always to fix them into the limits of a creed, an unchangeable law, a particular system, it must be prepared to see them revolting from its control. For although they may accept this impress for a time, and greatly profit by it, in the end they must move, by the law of their being, towards a freer activity and an untrammeled movement. Spirituality respects the freedom of the human soul, because it is itself fulfilled by freedom. And the deepest meaning of freedom is the power to expand and grow towards perfection by the law of one's own nature, Dharma. This liberty it will give to all the fundamental parts of our being. It will give that freedom to philosophy and science which ancient Indian religion gave, freedom even to deny the spirit, if they will, as a result of which philosophy and science never felt in ancient India any necessity of divorcing themselves from religion, but grew rather into it and under its light. It will give the same freedom to man seeking for political and social perfection, and to all his other powers and aspirations. Only it will be vigilant to illuminate them, so that they may grow into the light and law of the Spirit, not by suppression and restriction, but by a self-searching, self-controlled expansion, and a many-sided finding of their greatest, highest, and deepest potentialities. For all these are the potentialities of the Spirit.